Hello, everyone. So I wanted to go ahead and just kind of give you a little bit of just a brief overview on the type of research that you are going to be doing for your community presentations. Ultimately, we are striving to understand a culture that you are not readily a part of, right? So it doesn't necessarily have to be a culture that you're not familiar with, but a culture that is different than the culture that you primarily identify with. So that's ultimately our end goal. By now, you should have identified a culture. If you want to change, that's fine, but you need to do so really, really soon. It's probably not a good idea to wait on that. I want you to do that immediately if you want to go ahead and change your culture. Also, you kind of need to be identifying a gatekeeper or someone that you want to interview and ways that you want to observe your culture. But ultimately, the end goal of Project 2 is just to understand a culture that you're not a part of. That's it. That's the big picture. So I wanted today to just kind of go ahead and talk a little bit more about research. We've already mentioned credibility of sources and kind of evaluating sources. So today is kind of a piggyback off of that as we look at just the broader picture of research in general. The fancy word for the type of research that you are going to be completing as you study your culture is an ethnography. So basically what it is just a research method that helps us learn about cultures, how they behave and communicate through observing them in their natural setting. So I want you to just kind of pinpoint your focus onto two main key areas with that. So you're observing people, that's one, in their natural setting, yes, but you're looking specifically at how they behave and how they interact and how they communicate. So ultimately, those are the primary things. You're observing people in their natural habitat and you're watching how they behave and communicate. So as you go out into your cultures, you're watching people to see how they behave and how they communicate in their natural setting. That's it. So what you're doing by going into this natural setting is you're participating in field work, which is basically just immersing yourself into this culture and into this community. So it's not just a matter of being able to step back and read some books. Your primary source research will be you going out into these communities, into these cultures, and observing and studying people in their natural habitat. So ultimately, you have to ask yourself three questions. Number one, who or what will be studied, which ultimately you should have already been answering. What data collection strategies will be used, and we're going to talk about those as we go on today. And then what methods will be used to analyze and interpret the data, which we're also going to talk a little bit about today. So those are some just research overviews and kind of painting the umbrella portrait of ethnography and field work and what you're trying to accomplish. So as you look at this, you need to identify a time period and a site and a community. So hopefully you've already done that. We don't need to spend a ton of time doing that. The primary data collection strategy that you are going to be working with for Project 2 is participant observation. Basically participating in the community. Now, you can do that through multiple ways. If you're observing SGA and you're watching student government, you could go to meetings, you could take notes, you could interview people outside of the meeting setting. You could watch a different event that they do and kind of how they interact with students and kind of how they serve students, any number of things. But ultimately, you want to do interviews. You want to collect field notes. You want to study everyday interactions. That's what you want to try to accomplish. So you're interviewing someone from SGA. You're collecting notes on the meetings, on their interactions, on how they behave, on how they communicate with each other. And then you're just studying what they do every day. Now, as a result of that, that's your interpretation of the interview, of the participant analysis, of the everyday interactions. How you analyze those is important for how you structure your paper. So ultimately, you want to accomplish a thematic analysis. Hopefully all of this is fitting together underneath this giant puzzle of research. But a thematic analysis basically just identifies common themes and recurrent patterns in the data. Okay? So ultimately, as you go out and as you observe and as you talk to people, you start to notice themes and patterns and trends that emerge as a result of these everyday interactions that you're studying. So, with SGA, maybe you're noticing a trend of loyalty. Maybe you're noticing a trend of energy. Maybe you're noticing a trend of just compassion towards students. I don't know. It could be any number of things. But ultimately, based upon your research, you have to identify certain themes and trends that will kind of help bring about just what this community is all about. A primary means of accomplishing our task and kind of researching is performing a task of an interview. Now, for those of you who have never done an interview, I know probably most of you have been interviewed in some context, but maybe you've never actually, performed the task of an interview. What I like to do when I'm interviewing specifically for research is I try to ask a lot of open-ended questions because I don't necessarily want to guide their answers by just asking yes or no questions. But you want to give some semblance of a list of questions that you believe, like this is the direction that we're going to head, but not pigeonholing yourself to just asking those questions. Being able to kind of be flexible depending on where the interview is going and how everything's working itself out. So as you enter this interview process, first of all, you want to select the best person to interview. Ultimately, for a lot of you guys, it might just boil down to access, who is the most readily accessible within the communities that you're studying. You want to prepare the interview protocol, so that's listing out the questions, that's the time, that's the place. You, as the interviewer, want to work around the interviewee's schedule. So that means that it might not necessarily be a perfect time for you, but whenever this other person can be interviewed, you work yourself around their schedule to make it happen. Then you conduct the interview, and then you process it, and you just kind of look at that interview and the data that you've collected and figure out what are themes and patterns even within that interview that connect to the big picture of your culture. So ultimately, interview protocol, you want to ask several different questions. I'm not going to go over all of these, but I do want to focus on open-ended questions because I do believe that these are significant for research. Open-ended questions leave the possibility open for the answer to kind of go in a direction that you wouldn't expect. So if I were to say, is your favorite color blue? You have two choices in how to answer that, yes or no. But if I ask you, what is your favorite color, I don't necessarily pigeonhole you into answering blue. You can answer any way that you want to. So asking open-ended questions is great because it kind of allows some flexibility with the interview for you as the interviewer to be able to sit back and go, man, this is a different direction than I expected. Let's go with this because this is really good stuff. So read over these, figure out just the difference between primary and secondary questions, how to follow up questions, and ultimately you want to have a structure, a skeleton, a framework for questions, but you don't want to be so tied to it that you kind of relinquish opportunities to dive deeper into the interview. Hopefully that makes sense. Ultimately, for the interview, just go over a couple of these. You do want to dress professionally. You want to be prompt and courteous. They're taking time out of their day to be interviewed by you, and so you want to be professional about that. You want to ask permission to record. Some of you are going to try to record their answers just writing them down. I would not encourage that. I think that that's really difficult to do. If you want to, great, that's fine. But if I were you, I would go ahead and ask permission to record, and then I would go ahead and record the interview so that you can go back and listen to it again. You do want to listen carefully. Want to keep the interview moving, so hopefully it's not just that either you're unprepared and don't know what questions to ask next, or you don't want to just allow a person to camp on one question and then the breadth of what you wanted to try to figure out is not answered. Make sure you get permission to quote. Make sure you get permission if they do not want you to use their name, that's okay. Make sure you get permission for you to use their name. End on time, and then make sure you thank them for their time. That's pretty crucial and pretty important. So these are just some basics of interviewing, but ultimately you want to identify a gatekeeper, someone in your community that will give you access to the community, and then also in your community interview someone to interview. It can be the gatekeeper, it can be someone else, it doesn't matter. But ultimately you want to interview someone with a pretty wide range of knowledge about the community that you're studying. And then just ask them questions about their community, ask them questions about how people interact with the community, how they engage within the community, and then you're just trying to identify, as a result of this interview data, observation data, the notes that you take while observing, patterns and themes about the community that kind of explain who they are and what they do. So hopefully this helps bring about just a little bit more of a big picture on research, but also a little bit more of a big picture on your project too. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And if I can help in any way, just let me know. All right, my friends, hopefully this helped. Excuse the fact that I had to bring about the rest of my screen. But if you need anything, if you have any other questions, please feel free to ask. Have a great day.